Tyler here to turn this one on. Well, good morning. It's good to see everyone this morning. We're glad you're here. If you're visiting with us, we're especially glad that you're here. You decided to come and worship God with us this morning. As we usually do when someone like me is up here, we will tell you that I'm not normally the preacher that's up here. That's kind of our tradition, I guess. Brother Kenny is away on a gospel meeting. Asked me to fill in for him this morning. I was glad to do that, but I won't be able to fill Kenny's shoes or any of his other clothes. But Kenny, if you're watching this later, I meant that you're tall, really tall. But hopefully I have a few ideas, a few thoughts maybe this morning that we can talk about, and hopefully that'll help each of us as we continue on our walk to be more like Christ. I have a little bit of what I call a Flipboard addiction. I don't know if you're aware of what Flipboard is, but it's an app you can put on your phone, and it brings in news articles from all different places and aggregates them together, and then it's also built around topics that you are interested in. And so, I will spend a lot of time flipping through different articles and looking for things that I want to read. And but I came across an article recently that caught my attention for a couple reasons. And this article was based on a study that was done in 2015. And the study claimed that children raised in religious homes are less empathetic and less kind toward others than those that are not. So basically, the study said, this was an academic study that said this research said that this was true. And so I read through this article a little bit, and then I did a little research on the actual study that said this, and turns out that it's pretty much fake news. Okay? The article that it's based on was seriously methodologically flawed. And it was basically, as you researched it more and more, you found that that what they did was not really research. It really was a hit piece on people that are believers. But it got me to thinking about some things along these lines, because I thought about this before. How empathetic are we? And is empathy a really important trait of a Christian? I know that you might find this hard to believe, but when I was a younger man, like late teens or early 20s, I probably wasn't very empathetic. I thought that, I kind of knew everything, and I'd studied a lot of the Bible. I had listened to preachers and Bible class teachers, and pretty much figured, I think I got kind of everything figured out. And as you know that are a little bit older, and as you grow older, the older you get, the more you figure out that you don't know. And hopefully, as we get older, we get some wisdom. One of the things that we're talking about in our high school class right now is how do we get wisdom? Okay? And obviously, we can ask God for wisdom. He tells us to. We get wisdom by our experiences the same way, and I think we can look at empathy in the same way. That's one way that we can get more empathetic. And as I've grown older, I've thought more about this and the value of it and how it applies to our walk as a Christian. So we're going to look at a couple things this morning, and I entitled this lesson, The Value of Empathy. And it's kind of the value of empathy in the life of the Christian. So I'm going to look at these questions. What's empathy? Is it important? Right? And how can we be more empathetic if we find that it is? So here are some sort of textbook definitions of empathy. I know at first I kind of thought I knew really what it was, and I really found out that it's kind of really broken down into more than one thing. It's multidimensional. So, and empathy can be classified as emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is that we're able to share the feelings of someone else. So we actually emotionally can feel what they're going through or how they feel. whenever this morning when Drew started in his lesson, I started thinking, he's teaching my lesson as he was talking about some of the things and some of the comments that Randy made. But in the end, I think it really sort of more dovetails together and hopefully fits together in what that we're teaching. This concept of emotional empathy. An example might be, if someone that loses a loved one, a really close loved one, and you have lost a really close loved one before, you emotionally can actually feel that loss, right? I mean, you know exactly how they feel because you've felt it too. And that can happen in a lot of different areas. That's an emotional type of empathy. Cognitive empathy is this idea of intellectual empathy, or the ability for us to think and reason and put ourselves in the position of someone else in order to empathize with them. We may not have experienced that exact thing, but we have the God-given ability to think, what if I were that person? What if I put myself in their position? Could that help me better understand what they're going through and better communicate with them about what they're going through? And lastly, compassionate empathy. And this is really there's some differences in opinion on this, that compassion is not empathy. It's a separate thing, but empathy usually leads to compassion. Okay? And compassion is the idea that we feel this thing for someone else, we understand their need, and then we actually do something about it. Okay? So if we're really compassionate about someone, then we will try to do what we can to help them. Okay, so that gives a kind of a base sort of idea, hopefully, of sort of where I'm coming from on this. So, is empathy important? Let's look at Matthew chapter 12, and we'll read this. It says, starting in verse 28, "Then one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceived that he had answered them well, and asked him, which is the first commandment of all? And Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." So in Jesus' answer, all right, he tells us these two things, and he says no other commandment is greater than these. And so as I thought about this, why is that? Why are these the two greatest commandments? And what I thought was the reason is because if you have these two things, you pretty much have it all. You're going to do what God wants you to do, and you're going to react to people around you and to your neighbors in the way that you're supposed to react. And everything else, as he says in other verses, hang on these things, all the law and the prophets. So I think that Christians, in my opinion, don't struggle as much with the first commandment. Okay? I think that we're here, most of us that are here today, we love God. We want to put Him first in our life and in all these things. And I truly believe that, and I think we do, and I think most Christians are like that. But maybe we struggle a little bit more with the second one. Okay? I think I do, with this idea of loving our neighbor. And how do we do that? So one of the things that is asked was asked of Jesus is, who is the neighbor? Okay, so you might remember the story in Luke chapter 10, the lawyer came to Jesus and asked him this question, and Jesus told him the parable, what we call the parable of the Good Samaritan. Right? So as some passed by, and ones that should have helped didn't help, and then one that did pass by and helped him. So he asked the question. Jesus asked the question back. Well, then who was the neighbor? And Jesus said, the one that had mercy on him. Or the person responded that way, and Jesus said he was correct. Well, I think we could think of that also as compassion, right? Mercy or compassion. When the Good Samaritan saw that person, he had compassion on him. He wanted to help. He did something to help. So who is Who is our neighbor? I mean, the question's pretty obvious, right? It's all these people. Okay? Our neighbor is everyone, and in the context, I think, of the Bible and Jesus, that's what he means, that whoever we're dealing with, we're supposed to love our neighbor. And how do we do that? Or what can help us do that? What can help us if we struggle with that? What about our enemy? Did Jesus tell us to love our enemy? How do we do that? All right? Somebody that's trying to hurt us, somebody that's trying to tear us down, that's actually our enemy. We read about that in Matthew chapter 5, right, starting in verse 43. It says, have you heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy? But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. What? That's pretty hard, isn't it? That you may be sons of your Father in heaven, and he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So Jesus tells us that we're supposed to love our enemies. So let's look at a really extreme example, maybe, of someone who might be our enemy. Okay? We know that there are people in the world today, somewhere in this world, that would kill us, kill you, kill me, just because we're a Christian, if they found out. And if they found out we were American Christian, they would even more likely to kill us. Okay? But just for that purpose. And so, and there's obviously many ways that we can look at this. I mean, those people are humans. They're God's creation. God wants them to come to him. But when we think about them, how can we maybe understand them a little bit better? And I think one way that we can use is this concept of empathy. And we'll see, I think we can apply that a little bit more in a second to some other things as well. So what if you were born in some area of the world where everyone you know, everyone around you hates Christians? Yeah. You basically never even met anyone that doesn't hate Christians. What if you've been taught your entire life that Christians are evil, that Christians are out to hurt you? Your family's taught you that. Your parents have taught you that. Your grandparents have taught you that. And not only that, when you go to school, they teach you that not only are Christians dangerous, but really anybody who doesn't believe what you believe is dangerous. And from a small child, that's what you've been taught every day. Okay. So here's the hard question. Would you be any different? Do you really think you would be any different if you were raised in that exact circumstance as people are being raised today and have throughout history? Okay, this isn't new. Christians were persecuted right from day one. Terrible things were done to them. But would we really be any different? Okay. Does that cause us to think a little bit? Does maybe it make us a little uneasy to kind of think about that? It kind of does me. All right. So can developing empathy help us understand our neighbor a little bit better? Okay, and when we talk about neighbor, we could talk about this person that we just talked about. Can we put ourselves in their place? Can we think like they think? Emotional empathy, it may not really be possible for us to connect with them on that level, but can we connect with them with this cognitive or intellectual empathy where we can understand that, you know what, if that happened to us, we might react the same way. And maybe that might change a little bit of how we look at them or how we react to them. Some other ways we can apply this. Okay, so that was the extreme example. Let's apply it this way. What if we were raised in a different religious group? We have some people here that have been raised in different religious groups, but are not here with us today. But I would say that, 90% probably were not. Okay, so how can we empathize with those people? Do we, when we interact with them, can we put ourselves in their position and think about this as well? What if I had grown up being taught that my whole life? And that was actually mentioned this morning in Bible class. Where would I be? What would I do? What would I teach? Okay. How do we respond to a brother or a sister that's struggling with sin? Is our first reaction to condemn, right? Or is our first reaction to think about, what's happening in their life? How are they feeling? Maybe what caused what they're being involved in, and how can I help them? Okay, so this idea of the types of empathy that lead to compassion. How do I want to help them? If someone thinks that you are the kind of person that is going to just very quickly condemn them and bring out some Bible verses and say, look, this is where you're wrong and you need to change today. Now, I'm not saying that there may not be a point in time for that, because there is. But is that the first reaction? And if you're known as that type of person, is anyone going to come and seek help from you? How do we help someone that's maybe less knowledgeable or maybe a new convert? I thought my wife shared a really interesting story. I think that was shared in the women's meeting that was recently held about a new convert. I probably won't get this exactly right because it's like third, fourth hand, but where a new convert had came into a congregation and really that her dress was really not appropriate. Okay, that it was not becoming of what a Christian woman should wear. And so what could our reactions be to that? I mean, could someone take her aside? And what if one of the elders took her aside and said, look, I'm going to lay down the law to you. You're going to have to change what you're doing. Okay? Because this is why, here's the scriptures. And, Or I think what I was told is what happened is one of the ladies saw the problem, okay, learned to know the person, get to know them so that they had a relationship. There became some trust involved in there. And then when they went, hey, let's go shopping together, and went shopping and was able to then teach her, this is what's appropriate for a Christian to wear. Was that effective, you think? Yeah, right. That would be a very effective way and a more empathetic way. And you'll see too, right? It wasn't just that I empathize with it or that I'm going to teach you that you're wrong. It's that I'm compassionate, right? I actually did something. Right? I did something in that instance. What about, can we apply the same sort of concept to a brother or sister that holds a different view than us? Or maybe interpret scriptures somewhat differently? Okay. We have that in this congregation. Right? We have people that have different views on things. And, we interact with them sometimes. And how do we handle that? Do we do it from an empathetic standpoint? Do that we care about them? What about our own views? Do we have an open mind when we go and we meet with brethren and we talk about things that we have some differences of opinion? That was talked about a little bit this morning. Randy mentioned how that, many things that he thought years ago that he thinks differently about now. I'm exactly the same way. When I mentioned earlier, when I was a younger man, I had everything figured out and I knew my scriptures and I could sit down with somebody and I could show you where, why you need Jesus and this is why. Or if I was sitting down with somebody that had different religious views, I could say, this is why you're wrong. Here's the scripture. Okay? Not that effective. Okay? I didn't have any ability to sort of connect with them emotionally, understand and then in that way develop a relationship and a way to communicate with them so that we could then easily move in and talk about things that are important, okay? Things that I wanted to talk about. I've done this many times over my life. I've had many opportunities to speak to those in the area of the world that we live in now and that I've lived in the South. I mean, it seems like for the most part, we're dealing with people that believe differently than we do, although that they profess to be Christians and when we talk with them. And what I've learned is that not only don't I know everything, that I can learn things from anyone. Okay? So I have this, and now I have an understanding that, there's really not anyone out there that I can't sit down with, and if I will really listen, that I can learn something from them no matter what their religious background is. Okay? And I'm not saying that I accept error, okay? And that's something that's opposed to the Scriptures. But I'm saying that there are things that we can learn from anyone if we open our heart and we try. And I'll say this, if we're a Christian for many, many years and our views haven't changed at all on some Scriptures, okay, we may not be studying very much. Okay? Because what I've learned is the more that I study, the more I understand. Guess what? That's God's plan, right? The more we study, the more we understand about things. Let's look at the example of Jesus. I think this is obviously Jesus is our best example when we talk about things like this. In John 11, we know that Lazarus had died and was buried, and then it says when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell down at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." So in these verses we see Jesus, our perfect example, the empathy that he had on every level. Right? Emotionally he connected with these people. He groaned in the spirit. He was troubled. The people were weeping around him. And he even wept himself. And he had compassion on them, as we know. And so he has compassion on us in the same way. Look at Hebrews chapter 4, and we see a little bit about what this empathy and compassion that Jesus has done for us. He says, "Seeing then that we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need." So we see a few things here. One is that, and as we read in the Scriptures, a lot of times, we think, does Jesus really understand me? Jesus was God, right? Jesus lived with God. Jesus had powers to heal people, to cast out demons, right? To calm storms. He was deity. Can you really understand what it's like to be me? And the Scripture answers that question for us, right? The Scriptures tells us he was tempted in all ways that we are. And that's the reason why he can become the perfect intermediary for us, between us and God. Because he knows, he can empathize, and he's compassionate, and therefore that he was willing to sacrifice himself for us, which is obviously the ultimate show of someone that's empathetic and compassionate. He gave us the perfect example. He was rejected, he was despised, he was abandoned, scourged, beaten, spit upon, and he was crucified. And he died so that we may live. Hopefully the lesson was a little helpful to you this morning as we think about those things, as we think about how can empathy Help us when we deal with others, with our brethren, with those that we meet on a daily basis, possibly even with our enemies. Again, glad you're here. If you're here this morning and you need our help in any way, whether you need to obey the gospel or you need our prayers on your behalf, you have the opportunity now to come forward as we stand and sing.